Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video is a fun one and also a little bit controversial. Because today, friends, we're going to be chatting about some popular books that I personally do not think are worth the hype. Obviously, before I jump into the titles themselves, reading is a subjective experience. So if you liked these books, I'm happy for you. Unfortunately, I didn't, and that's okay. Without further ado, let's just go ahead and dive into the titles because I actually have quite a few to show off today. First book I'm going to chat about might be a little bit of a surprise because I do feel like it's a booktube, book talk fantasy baby, and that is going to be The Faithful and the Fallen series by John Gwynne. Now, I feel like I need to caveat this book within this overall video to say that I actually really liked the first one and I loved book 2 and I really enjoyed book 3, but I did not enjoy the fourth and final installment within this quartet. And in general, it just kind of left a bad taste in my mouth and made me really look back on the entire reading experience in an entirely different way. I also recognize that how I feel about this series is generally unpopular, and I do feel like you kind of will get a sense rather quickly, usually how you'll feel about this series overall, just based on the first book alone. I feel like I had kind of a rare situation in my experience with this book. This is a very classic fantasy story relying heavily on some beloved tropes, sort of setting up this good versus evil conflict. We follow a multitude of different perspectives of people all across this fantasy land. We see them intersect in really unexpected and fun ways, and we sort of see all the different sort of political facets and reality of all these different power players within this realm. This series does have a lot of strengths. John Gwynne has some great combat writing, and I did enjoy all the different character point of views, but by the end I found the plot to be very expected. The overall payoff of this series just wasn't there for me. I also found the characters to be kind of one-dimensional. Again, by the end of this reading experience, they almost felt like stereotypes of themselves. Just something about how the whole thing came together just sort of rubbed me the wrong way personally, but I also recognize that this is a very loved series for a reason, and in general, if you want to check this series out, I feel like you will know immediately based off the first book if you're gonna like it or not, because it is kind of a cheesy series, and for the most part that cheese was working for me until it wasn't, you know? Another very popular series I'm just not quite sure is worth the hype is the Red Rising series by Pierce Brown. I've now officially read the first 2 books in the original trilogy, and while I wouldn't say these were like the most terrible things I've ever read, though Red Rising was pretty bad, I still just cannot really fully understand why this series is so beloved. This, of course, is a sci-fi fantasy hybrid story following our main character Darrow. He lives in a very stratified society. Basically, everyone is organized by color, reds being at the bottom of society and golds being at the top, and based on your color, you sort of function and work differently within society. Darrow, our main character, as a red, sort of finds himself getting involved in revolution, and the plot sort of takes off from there. Personally speaking, Red Rising was quite bad. The writing style was very strange, the plotting was very strange. It was fast-paced, but like also repetitive and just kind of strange in its Roman influence. Golden Sun, which I have read this year, was better than the first one, but still left me sort of underwhelmed overall with this series. This is more of a case of like everyone seemingly gives all of these books 5 stars and I keep picking them up expecting to be blown away, but I'm just not. I don't love Darrow. I find the emotional stakes of this series to be severely lacking, and I feel like Pierce Brown's sort of just throwing everything at the wall to see what's going to stick plot-wise. I also feel like the scope and reality of this revolution is really not explored in a very effective way. I'm just overall not loving this series as much as I was hoping for. And I also kind of feel like I'm on an island with this. I'm one of the only people that just don't love this as much as everyone else, but I have to be honest, I'm not sure it's worth the hype, you know what I mean? Another incredibly beloved book that I personally just did not seem to love as much as everyone else is The Wishing Game by Meg Schaefer. Now, I will have a few disclaimers about this book before I sort of chat about my reasons, and one of them is that I actually did enjoy overall the writing style that Meg Schaefer had for this book, so that does mean I will check out other books that she's put out. In particular, she's had a newer release that I'm curious by. The setup of this book sounds cozy and endearing. It basically follows our main character, who is a teacher, and she dreams of being able to adopt this child, but she doesn't really have the funds to do so. One day, she receives this invitation to go to this mysterious island, which is owned by one of her favorite childhood writers, involved in this competition to win a manuscript of his final book. It's whimsical to a point, and I feel like a lot of the inputs feel like they would work quite well. There's a little bit of romance. The island is very strange and peculiar. It's trying to lean on some of these emotional notes, and we begin to learn more about our main character too and her past. I think at a high level, I did appreciate kind of the idea of this book, but I found the execution to also be very lacking. Overall, I felt like there were some very serious topics that I'm not sure were treated with the weight that they needed to be throughout the story, and were almost included as a way to just kind of be a part of the plot, but not really given the thoughtfulness that some of these topics should have, if that makes sense. I also found some of the elements of the romance to be a little peculiar. Again, I like this sort of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, strange island with this reclusive author situation. I thought that was fun, and the writing style wasn't too bad, but I just found like the plot elements and how the story sort of came together just didn't personally work for me in the way that I was hoping it would. Another book that left me a little underwhelmed, but is also another super popular read, is Shark Heart. This was nominated for Best Fiction in 2023 for the Goodreads Choice Awards, and my book club was so excited to pick it up, but I think pretty much a universal experience, not just for myself, but for the book club, was that it was just okay. Another book that I feel like delivered partially, but just not fully, and conceptually was like an interesting story. This is a book that basically follows a recently married couple, and they're so excited to embark on their new married life and see and explore the world together. But unfortunately, at the very beginning of their marriage, the husband is actually diagnosed with a very rare disease where he's slowly going to turn into a shark. And in this reality of their world, basically everything is the same except that there is this sort of medical condition where people can turn into animals. And it's definitely supposed to be a stand-in for the realities of long, prolonged illness and the impact on family and relationships, and exploring the emotional impact of that reality. Again, aspects of this book I felt like were really interesting. The writing style was very unique. It was more so written like a play, which was cool, and we're often shifting from scene to scene and between our two main characters. Overall, though, it sort of felt like the story was two stories sort of stuck together, and I think the author maybe had a hard time deciding on what they wanted the core of the story to be made up of. Is it this present day storyline of this husband and wife, or is it this past storyline of a whole nother character? Both were interesting individually, but I feel like putting them together kind of created a reality where neither got as much time as they should have to really flesh out the narrative and story. Strong concept, good writing style, again, just sort of fell flat on the execution for me. Another book that I see making the rounds online, and a book that honestly disappointed me quite a bit, is Heartless Hunter by Kristen Sorelli. This book has like a 4.4 on Goodreads, and I truly am perplexed. I think at a high level, I can understand why a lot of people are picking this book up, because it does house a lot of very fun tropes. It basically follows our main character, who is a witch and moonlights as this individual called the Crimson Moth, ferrying witches to safety, and she begins to court a witch hunter to provide better cover for her Crimson Moth identity. This is a fantasy novel set in a world that's basically giving like French Revolution, Russian Revolution vibes. Witches were once in charge, they've now been overthrown by this new government, and witches have been outlawed, and it's obviously very dangerous for them to practice magic within this world. I feel like aspects of this was fun. Relationship, the will they won't they, the dramatic irony that existed between this witch and witch hunter character. The side characters were bananas, and the plot sort of just happened to you with no real like build up or logic behind it. It just felt like very run-of-the-mill YA fantasy, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's just surprising given how popular it is. And like, there's really great YA fantasy out there, and this to me is just not that, you know? Another book that was actually a recent read that is one that I enjoy, but I didn't end up loving as much as I thought I was going to. And again, this book has a super high rating online. This is also an example of a book that I wouldn't say is bad. It was just sort of good when I was hoping it was going to be fantastic. That book is The Book of Doors by Gareth Brown. This book, if I'm being honest, just didn't feel that unique. I feel like I've encountered this narrative experience before in other stories, and in my opinion, those stories did it better. Again, this is just my personal opinion. This is a contemporary fantasy thriller-esque novel, and in it we're following our main character, who at the beginning of the story lives a very normal life. She works in a bookstore, and one night one of her favorite customers actually passes away in the store, leaving behind for her this very mysterious book called The Book of Doors. She quickly realizes that this book is actually magic and allows her to sort of walk through any door and travel anywhere she wants, but this also quickly puts her on the radar of some very dangerous people, because there's lots lots of people who want to collect not just this magical book, but there's also other magical books that exist within this world, kind of throwing our main character's life upside down. The strengths of this book are the plot. There's definitely some fun, fast-paced, engaging plot elements to this, like the twists and turns are definitely there in a way that kept me flipping the pages. A weakness of this book by far is the characterization. I never felt fully connected to any of our main characters we were reading from, and I wasn't even particularly scared by some of the villains we were reading from either. Everyone felt kind of at a distance. And I feel like if this book kind of had a more beautiful writing style, that distance could work. There was just something about this book that didn't fully come together for me. There was elements that I liked. There was no elements I would say I loved. And so because of that, I would just say this book was okay. It was good. It just wasn't fantastic, and it's not as good as I feel like I'm seeing maybe some other reviews online. Like, it was fine, solidly fine. But if you want to read a book like this, you should actually read The Shadow of the Wind, because that book is amazing. Another super popular book that I read and I feel like is just fine versus the amazing glowing reviews I feel like I see everywhere, One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. I included this in my most recent version of this video, but I went ahead and gave this series another chance, and I actually read this sequel quite recently, and unfortunately this series still left me wanting more and was just kind of overall disappointed with the experience by the end. This is a romantasy fantasy story that centers a very interesting magic system. It's set in this fantasy world where this kingdom is surrounded by this dangerous mist, and every year the mist further and further encroaches on the civilians living here, making life harder and harder every year. There's also a magic system that utilizes like a deck of cards. Different cards have different powers, and you can tap into using this magic by just holding or possessing one of these cards. That aspect of this book is very interesting. This is a series that I feel like has so many great inputs and ideas, and I just feel like the execution was left lacking for me. And I feel like if this was drawn out, maybe this series was longer or more books, we could have really had something amazing, because the author has talent, particularly in her writing style and her worlds and concepts. But I just felt like, again, the character interactions, the character pacing, the plot pacing, just the speed in which everything sort of happened and resolved itself just left very little room for anticipation or stakes, because it felt very obvious where everything was going to go. And then we kind of got there and I was like, okay, yeah, I saw that coming. You know what I mean? Another great example of something that's not bad, but just also was just okay, in my opinion. And given that this is like one of the most popular fantasy series out there right now, I just feel like there's some other better options in my mind versus this, if I'm being honest. The next book I'm going to chat about might be a little bit of a surprise because it's a Brandon Sanderson book. But the book I'm talking about is the Frugal Wizards Guide to Surviving Medieval England. This is probably my least favorite Brandon Sanderson book I have ever read. And I honestly would just like recommend not reading it, especially if you're newer to Brandon Sanderson. I would hate for someone to start their Brandon Sanderson journey somehow with this book, and it sort of deters them from trying out and reading other novels of his, because in general, I love Brandon Sanderson's writing, plotting, characters, humor, how things all tie together. I'm constantly and consistently entertained, but that just was not the case with this secret novel installment by this author. Conceptually, as you would expect from Brandon Sanderson, it's a really cool idea. We're basically following our main character who wakes up in this sort of medieval England era place, and he realizes that he has been transported there into like a parallel version of our medieval England. Magic exists here, but he has no memory of who he is, why he's here, but he only has a burnt up pamphlet of like the service he used to like teleport to this new place. From there, he sort of quickly gets wrapped up in this like larger mystery and issue that is existing within this medieval landscape. And honestly, the core issue of this book isn't necessarily the idea or the fantasy elements of the world or the magic. It was the character point of view. The main character of this book, in my opinion, is just not that likable, and he's so full of lots of unfunny jokes that by the end you're just kind of cringing and hoping it'll end soon, if I'm just being fully honest. It just didn't work for me. The humor and the character point of view I just couldn't fully get behind, which sort of took me out of the story entirely. But obviously I love Brandon Sanderson's writing, and I basically would recommend so many of his other books, but I will say I don't think this book is worth the hype. I feel like Brandon Sanderson carries a lot of hype given his name, but this book is one maybe to skip. Not even part of the Cosmere, so No harm, no foul. Alrighty guys, those are some very popular books that I personally think are not worth the hype. Let me know down below some popular reads that you personally think are just not worth the read, as I would love to know. I love controversial opinions, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye!